This is Scorched, East Africa's climate crisis. Thanks for joining us. I'm Keir Simmons. Over the next half an hour, we are taking an in-depth look at a region being described as ground zero for climate change. Take just one country, Somalia, where the rains have failed to fall for 5 years. That's 5 years without rain. Add into that a seemingly continuous conflict and skyrocketing food prices. And what do you get? Oxfam calls it the worst hunger crisis in living memory. The suffering is of a staggering scale. But are we paying enough attention? Are we ignoring the calls for help? Are we too exhausted by global emergencies to pay attention? I'm just back from Kenya, where community leaders told me of fertile lands just a decade ago that now look a lot like desert. They are suffering from global warming they did not cause. We're going to break it down. What's happening? Why is it happening? And what can be done? We begin in northern Kenya, where we saw firsthand the impacts of climate change, the desperate search for food and water that has turned into a tragic gold rush, people scouring the land for tiny specks of metal that could buy something to eat. Across a scorched landscape, over dry riverbeds in northern Kenya, we find more than 2,000 migrants in a makeshift village so remote it's not on the map. And families driven to desperation by a devastating drought, sifting through the sand, hoping to find pieces of gold. 18-year-old Olivia came here 7 months ago. Did you find any gold this week? No gold this week. Esakariat is 50. He arrived in July, hoping to feed 5 children. How often does he find gold?
After 5 days.
After 5 days?
Yeah.
Paulina shows me what a piece of gold looks like. A speck on the tip of a finger. That will pay for the first food she's had in 2 to 3 days. These people aren't trying to get rich. They're just trying to eat. I'm hungry, she's saying. I'm hungry. They were once simple farmers with fertile land. They did not cause climate change. Like 7-month-old Jacinta, living with her mother Rebecca in a small tent. For the first time in Lossal village, a children's clinic has arrived.
Jacinta is severely malnourished.
If she can't hold down food, they'll rush her to the hospital. Francis from UNICEF feeds her, a little at a time.
So he has good appetite.
It's good news.
Yes.
You look happy, you're smiling.
Yeah, I look happy. I feel like the baby has good potential of getting cured.
But fueling the crisis is the war in Ukraine, hitting supplies of staple foods. And UNICEF says inflation is impacting even operations like this.
This peanut-based paste is almost miraculous in the way it can help children survive that most deadly of malnutrition. But the prices of this have skyrocketed as well.
Tonight, there is little time left to save the lives of children like Jacinta. Millions are growing up on the front lines of this climate change crisis, an emergency unfolding across East Africa. Joining us now is Zainab Wandati. She is the Science and Technology Editor at NTV Kenya, where she reports from the front line of the climate and food security issues facing Kenyans today. Guy Avignon, from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. He's head of Sub-Office Dadaab. And Michael Nine-Heiss, CEO and President of UNICEF USA. Thank you all for joining us. Michael, the viewers saw there, you and I were in northern Kenya together, and you were telling me when we were there that you were really struck by some of the desperation you saw that was new to you with even your experience. Tell people watching how that impacted you.
Well, it is a crisis that's just not getting enough attention. It is one of the biggest crises in the world right now. We know that there are 5.7 million children in the region that are either in or approaching acute malnutrition. This can be deadly for them. There are 15 million kids that are out of school because they've been displaced. This is a huge crisis going on. And yeah, I've been doing humanitarian development work for 25 years, and this is some of the most desperate situations I've seen.
You've not seen before, Michael, some of the scenes that you saw when you were with me in northern Kenya.
No, for sure. We visited a village together where families are digging holes 20 feet in diameter, down about 30 feet into the ground to find groundwater. And this is in a dry riverbed, and women go down, kind of cycle down into the bottom and create a bucket brigade to haul up a little bit of groundwater out of the bottom for themselves and for their animals. And, we stood on that dry riverbed and looked down, I don't know, a quarter of a mile or so, and all you could see are these massive holes and women descending in them to pull groundwater out. That's how desperate this is.
Yeah, and we're going to see some of that later in the show, Michael. Zainab, I want to go to you. You've been bringing attention to climate change in this part of the world. One of the most frustrating things about this situation is that these are people paying the price for climate change, but contributing the least to climate change. How much of what's happening is caused by climate change?
All of it, actually. All of it is caused by climate change. And you did mention correctly there that these are people suffering the worst impacts but contributing the least to the impacts of climate change. And it's not just in Kenya, it's all of Africa contributing the least to climate change but suffering some of the worst impacts. The droughts, right now, we've had 5 consecutive failed rain seasons. 5 consecutive failed rain seasons. Right now, we're supposed to be in a short rain season, but the rain is scattered across the country. And in the northern parts of the country where you went and it was dry, right now it's raining. But what's happening is the livestock are dying because of the rain. The rain is causing these animals to die of hypothermia. So drought is not good for them. But now the rain is not helping them either because livestock are dying massively. And so far, the government official records indicate that we've already lost 2.5 million heads of livestock. And for communities in northern Kenya, livestock is everything to them. Their lives, their entire lives revolve around livestock. They are not crop farmers. They do not dig the ground to grow food. They derive their food from the livestock that they have. So when the animals die, literally their lives fade away. And these are people suffering the brunt of climate change for a problem they did not cause. And we have a situation in another part of the country called Baringo, still in the Rift Valley. In Baringo, there's a community that has actually sued the government because of the impacts of climate change. And they're hoping to build on the precedent. There's a similar case in Australia, I think, or the international court, a community sued the government of Australia, and the court ruled in favor of that community. So this community, Baringo, is also looking to do the same. They have filed a case in court in Kenya to sue the government for failing to protect them against the impacts of climate change. That's just how bad the situation is on the ground.
Yeah, they're actually going to court to just try and get some of their rights back, if you like. Guy, one of your biggest jobs at the United Nations is helping people displaced by crisis and conflict. I want to share some reporting from our Sky News colleague, Africa correspondent Yusra Al-Bagir, who made the dangerous trip to Somalia.
Nearly 1 million people in Somalia have been displaced by extreme hunger, and more than half of them are here. Baidoa is a town that has many displacement camps, and they're well established, but every day they keep growing as more people arrive. Close to half of Somalia's population is now in need of food assistance. Why did you come to this camp? Baidoa has become the epicenter of a looming famine, the human cost of climate change, and it's young children who are suffering the most. What's wrong with her? This won't be the first time Somalia faces famine. In 2011, more than 200,000 people lost their lives. Nearly half of them were children. Yusra Al-Bagir, Sky News, Baidoa, Somalia.
Guy, there in Somalia, you have it all. Climate change, conflict, rocketing food prices. How do you unravel all that, Guy?
Okay, so I am on the Kenya side, but close to the Somali border. The situation that we just saw in the reporting is exactly the same one prevailing on the Kenya side, to the exception of insecurity, because in Somalia they are having to grapple with a lot of insecurity caused by armed groups that ransom the population, hold the population at ransom, but also the effects of climate change. And a lot of people cross the border into Kenya to seek refuge. So, and the context right now is characterized by lack of resources to face those emergencies, because the Kenyan population itself is already grappling with the effects of drought. In addition to that, thousands of people are crossing the border into Kenya. There's between the end of last year and now in the Dadaab area, we have received up to 80,000 people who are coming to an area already stricken by drought, and we are having to struggle with assisting the host community, but also assisting those who have crossed the border. And I can assure you, it is very difficult without resources.
Is the conflict causing the crisis, or is climate change fueling the conflict, then causing the crisis? Or is it just an impossible, vicious circle?
No, there was already a bedrock of a protracted conflict. You know, Somalia has been a country in crisis for many, many years. And all these climate change effects are making the situation worse. Even when the harvests are good, there are armed groups who come and take the harvest from the population. So you can imagine now the loss of livelihood in a context where the meager resources left are also taken away from them. The cattle are taken away, so they are left with nothing, and they find themselves obliged to run away and cross into neighboring Kenya. And we are on the other side of the border, on the Kenya side, and it is a very difficult situation right now, very close to the one that was described in the Turkana area, and the one that we've just seen. But in addition, ours is people running away from both conflict and climate change, but one preceded the other, and then it's just compounding it.
Yeah, Zainab, when I was in northern Kenya with Michael, I saw just what was being described there and talked about by Guy. Families who'd moved, walked long distances, often across borders, just to be able to live. What's the biggest challenges you've seen in your reporting?
You see, for a lot of these communities that are worst hit by drought in Kenya, there are at least 23 counties that are affected by the drought. And what's common about them is that they are pastoral communities mostly. And for some of these pastoral communities, especially those in the northern part of the country, like in Turkana where you went, they are warrior communities. Traditionally, they're warrior communities. So regardless of whether there's a drought or not, there's always inter-community conflict because they steal cattle from each other. That's their way of life. But the drought has exacerbated that, because, as you know, for them, they look at livestock. Your wealth is determined by how many animals you have. The more animals you have, the richer you are. And if the drought is wiping away these animals, that's your wealth diminishing. So you feel the need to fight a lot more and steal a lot more so that you can rebuild your herd. And in that way, the harder the drought gets, the more the conflict is fueled. And besides getting access to food for these people is one of the greatest challenges they have: access to food and access to water. And in fact, the communities themselves, they say what they need the most is water and pasture. Once we figure that out, how they can get pasture for their animals and where to get the water, then they'll be fine. And there have been a couple of efforts being made to try and get them this assistance. But you see, given that these are warrior communities, some of these places are very remote. I saw your report, you went to a very remote village. Some of these places are very remote. They're not covered by road networks. They're not covered by communication. You may not be able to make a call there properly. So security becomes an issue. When a place is not easily accessible, security is not always guaranteed. And even UNHCR will tell you a lot of times traveling in those places, they have to go with police escorts. That's how bad the security issue is. So you may want to help these people, but because of insecurity, it becomes difficult. So that's also one of the greatest challenges that these areas face.
Zainab, Guy and Michael, I want to thank you for all of your insights. Coming up, a school for girls and their hopes for a better future. Stay tuned for our conversation on what we can do about those problems. Welcome back to Scorched, East Africa's climate crisis. Let's go back to Kenya and a school for girls where even the youngest are rationing porridge and water. And even with these daunting circumstances, many told me they are hopeful and dreaming of a future they can change.
These girls are learning to hope despite horrifying hardship. Finally, they have fresh water at St. Perpetual Girls' School, part of UNICEF's work to ease a fast-developing drought in East Africa. While their headmistress is an inspiration.
You can show these girls that a woman can
make it.
Can make it.
Can make it in life. Even in these harsh times, with the little they have, with no food, they can still make it.
The school has some food, but she has to ration it. Only the very youngest and these students facing exams get lunch.
Yeah, this food is porridge. See, porridge. We drink porridge.
You'd think that might knock their spirits. Not these girls.
Are you hopeful that you will do well in your exams?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
An hour's drive from the school, crossing riverbeds dry from the 4-year drought. More evidence of a climate change disaster impacting, by one estimate, 22 million people in East Africa right now. We find a community in unimaginable conditions.
We just arrived in this community and look, everywhere there are these deep, deep holes.
The desert is punctured with holes at least 30 feet deep. And then we see this, mothers and even their children clambering down, disappearing underground, risking their lives to pass up buckets of brown water.
It caved in over here.
That cave over there.
It caved in over here already.
They say one mother was killed when a hole fell in.
Aren't you frightened to go down there?
Because of the problems they face, they have no choice.
We're thirsty, Nachomin says.
When you see families having to do this just to get water, it's so frustrating when you know how possible it is to provide clean water.
As we leave, the women dance, dramatising their plight. While back at the school, supported by UNICEF,
it's a big victory, this place, but the challenge is much bigger than this one place.
The girls told us they love learning and the hope of a future that's a little less uncertain. Their dreams undimmed.
Well, so far we've presented many problems, but with that must come solutions. Joining us now to help us looking forward, Dr. Deepmala Mala, Keir's Vice President of Humanitarian Affairs. She just returned from a refugee camp in Dadaab, where she was working with Somali refugees. Michelle Gavin, the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She recently published a report on climate change and instability in the Horn of Africa and possible solutions to the growing regional issues. And Guy Avignon with UNHCR is back with us. Dr. Deepmala, first of all, you've been on the ground in Dadaab, where there are many Somali refugees. We were talking in the earlier segment about what's happening in Somalia. What are you seeing there?
What we are seeing is a catastrophic situation, I would say. And in addition to the Somali refugees who have been in Dadaab for a couple of decades, there are new arrivals, hundreds and thousands of them. And majority of them, I would say more than 80%, are women and girls. And when I talk to them, why did they come here? They said, back home, there's no water to drink, there's no food to eat, and there's so much insecurity. And I met girls who were 16 or 17, pregnant, some of them the second time, and they have undertaken journeys for 4 or 5 days. Some of them put all their savings, sold whatever they had to hire a vehicle which could bring them till here. So, and when we asked about perspectives to go back, there was a very, very loud and clear, absolutely not. And you could see the fear in them, the fear of the drought, the fear of death, and the fear of insecurity. So what we are seeing is a situation which demands urgent attention and action from all of us.
Michelle, I want to go to you now. You have over 20 years of experience studying problems in this area, working in government and non-government roles. everybody watching will have this deep sense of frustration. You want to do something, but what do you do short of kind of, I guess, just kind of giving up your job and heading there to help? But even that doesn't really help, does it? I mean, what are the solutions?
Well, it is important, of course, to provide the resources right now for people in urgent crisis. But given the reality of climate change, it's going to be equally important to sort of situate ourselves, revamp some things structurally to address these issues so we don't find ourselves in this kind of urgent crisis. And that does mean increasing household resilience, right? You don't want households on the brink where one failed rainy season means disaster. There has to be some kind of social safety net. And, you know, Kenya and Ethiopia have developed social safety net programs, and Somalia has a nascent one. We need to be making appropriate investments in adaptation, in resilience, in the kinds of agriculture that the previous panelist was just talking about. So we have to be moving out on multiple fronts.
Yeah, Guy, it's been over 35 years since the likes of Queen, Elton John, Madonna took the stage at Live Age, a music event to raise money for the famine in Ethiopia, in East Africa. There have been countless other fundraising efforts for Africa. Should we feel frustrated? Should we still feel positive? Is there something that we haven't done that we aren't doing?
First of all, we need to remain optimistic. We know this year is very difficult. I think there is also a need for us to change our paradigms. And I like what was said before by Malar, who was on the same flight with me this morning, by the way, coming from Dadaab, where we were looking at new ways, because we are doing things both globally but also locally, increasing resilience. How do we do that? How do we help people develop livelihood activities wherever they are? How do we chip in to make sure that our interventions are not done the traditional way, but how do we come up with new ideas to assist people and help them develop their own self-resilience and develop their own livelihoods? In Kenya right now, they've come up with what they are calling the Marshall Plan for assistance to refugees, which integrates host communities and refugees, meaning that making sure that they work together to make sure that they can be self-reliant. And if we can push in this direction while other institutions are looking at climate change globally, at grassroots level, if we can make sure that there is a peaceful coexistence between two communities equally affected by drought and other climate change, related climate change issues, I think we will go a long way. Changing the way we do assistance involve the communities themselves, and then chipping in with targeted assistance for them to become self-sufficient. And I think this will go a long way. But of course, we need assistance. Everyone else around the table has already said it. Let me add my voice to the chorus and say that we need this type of assistance. Right now, attention is being diverted to other conflicts worldwide, Ukraine being one of them. But we remain confident that if this region is given the attention it requires, we can do a lot of things to get out of this crisis situation.
Is that the one thing, Guy, and I'll let you have the last word here, is that the one thing that you want people to walk away knowing and understanding that they shouldn't just be distracted? There's so much else going on in our lives, our own cost of living crisis wherever we live, but that there is a challenge in East Africa that cannot be ignored.
Yes, definitely. Because if these crises are ignored, they trigger other crises that have a knock-on effect on the rest of the world as well, because we cannot turn our backs to conflict because they are very far away, because one way or the other, look at what's happening right now in Iraq, in Ukraine, look at the global crisis now, inflation on the rise. So every crisis, wherever it takes place, has an impact elsewhere in the world. I think people need to know this and be mindful of the need to to take action when it is still time and not think that this is something too remote to affect them. And that will be my end word. And support is required, and it is required now.
Dr. Deepmala, Michelle and Guy, thank you all so much for your time. There are perhaps reasons why East Africa isn't getting enough attention. We're all distracted. It's dangerous to report from some places there. And, let's be honest, there's a tendency to focus on Europe and America. So, thank you for watching.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.